Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining our event today. My name is Cassidy Charles, and I am the president of the Organization of Asian Studies, the project assistant for the East Asian National Resource Center, and a master's candidate in the Asian Studies program here at the George Washington University. I'm incredibly honored and excited to be a part of hosting this panel on Asian American, Pacific Islander inclusivity in academia, media, policy, locally, and in community organization. I believe it is incredibly important to support discussion on challenges facing these communities and hear how we all can be supportive in addressing and resolving them. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this event, Dr. Jisoo Kim. Dr. Kim is the Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. She currently serves as the Director of the Institute for Korean Studies and the Co-Director of the East Asian National Resource Center at GW. She also serves as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Korean Studies. She's a specialist in gender, law, and emotions in Korean history. Her broader research interests include gender and sexuality, crime and justice, forensic medicine, literary representations of the law, history of emotions, vernacular, and gender writing. She's the author of The Emotions of Justice, Gender, Status, and Legal Performance in Choson, Korea, which was awarded the 2017 James Pillay Prize of the Association for Asian Studies. Dr. Kim, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Cassidy, for that generous introduction. I would like to welcome all of you to our exciting event this afternoon. This event was organized as part of celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which will begin in May, as well as promoting our diversity initiative in our suite, which constitutes of East Asia NRC, GWIX, or GW Institute for Korean Studies, Sigur Center for Asian Studies, and Asian Studies program. Since we announced our diversity statement, which is available on our websites, our team has put a lot of efforts to make our programs open, inclusive, and reachable to diverse audiences as much as possible. We strive to generate programs that are not only inclusive, but reflective of diverse perspectives in Asian studies. For example, last October, we hosted Professor Harry Frankie Rivera's talk, The Korean War Remembrance and the Making of Modern Puerto Rico, to celebrate Latinx Heritage Month. In February, we invited Professor Thomas Lockley to give his book talk, African Samurai, The True Story of a Legendary Black Warrior in Feudal Japan, to celebrate the Black History Month. And today, we are excited to celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I would like to thank East Asia NRC, GWIX, Sigur Center for Asian Studies program, Organization of Asian Studies, and research team at the LU School of International Affairs. Thank you all for your co-sponsorship. I would like to especially thank Richard Haddock, Program Associate of NRC, and all staff members in making today's event possible. We are truly honored to have our panelists with us to share their views on today's topic. We wanted to bridge the gap among academia, policy, and the media in discussing Asian and Asian American inclusivity issue. I would like to first introduce our honorable guest speaker, Mr. Ben de Guzman, who will give his opening remarks. It is our great pleasure to introduce him today at our event. I would like to thank him for being with us despite his extremely busy schedule. Mr. Ben de Guzman is the director of the Mayor's Office on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs. He has been a leading voice at the local and national level on issues of racial equity, immigrants' rights, veterans' affairs, and LGBT justice for 20 years. He comes to his office from the Mayor's Office of LGBTQ Affairs, where he served as a community outreach specialist. During his tenure there, he helped execute two major first-time events for the Office of the District of Pride LGBTQ Cultural Performance event and the 32nd Annual 17th Street High Heel Race presented by the Mayor's Office as lead organizer. He also served as both the Public Information Officer and the Americans with Disabilities Act Compliance Officer for the agency. So thank you so much, Director Guzman, for being here with us.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be invited here to give you some greetings on behalf of the mayor. Um, as Director Kim said, I serve as the director for the mayor's office on Asian and Pacific Islander affairs here in the district. We I always talk about our agency as having a two-pronged mission. On one hand, we represent Mayor Bowser to the Asian American and Pacific Islander community here in the district. The census numbers just came out this week, and I think as people do a deeper dive into those numbers, I think the hope is that we will continue to see that the AAPI community is the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in the country, and that is certainly indicative of what we've experienced here in the district. At the same time, we serve as a gateway and as an advocate for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community to city government. So we make sure that all of our residents, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of the language that they speak, are all fully available to access and are inclusive of the city government that is supposed to represent them. Right. We are actually the largest agency of our kind in the country, which is a point that I'm always particularly proud to talk about. Out of all of the sort of city, local, state, and city agencies in the country that center AAPI constituents and residents, ours is the largest in the country. So take that, California. But finally, in terms of talking about our office, because of our relationship with the embassies, because we might be the only city in the country that has its own Secretary of State, because of Washington, D.C.'s reputation as a national and international city that you all are able to take advantage of here at GW, our office has been able to have an impact that's local, national, and international. So I just wanted to say a couple of things while I'm privileged to have your attention. And the first one is related to the diaspora that is kind of the raison d'etre, I think, in some ways, of the academic work that happens here. As someone whose work is informed both by my academic training as an undergrad at Berkeley, where we ironically studied diasporas from siloed and separated academic departments, such as, you know, the Asian American Studies Department, which was one of the first of its kind in the country, but very separate from Asian studies or Southeast Asian studies. You know, the irony of that was sort of lost on me as I was kind of a college kid trying to find his way. At the same time, it's informed by my training outside the classroom as a student organizer and later as a young civil rights advocate in an Asian American and Pacific Islander fishbowl, where the issues that I was working on were always seemed to be domestic issues as opposed to international issues. And learning later about that this was one of the binaries that I was put on this earth to try to help address and maybe finally dismantle in some ways. And I say this because I think this binary, this opposition between kind of domestic and international sometimes has real implications for policy and academic practitioners, even as policy versus academy is its own way a binary. You know, so thinking about immigration, for example, immigration advocates in the policy arena here in the US have historically looked at the issue through a domestic lens. And sometimes they leave geopolitical structures of nationhood and ultimately power uncontested. At the same time, on a very personal level, international practitioners of policy and academics here in the US can sometimes fail to understand the racial dynamics at work here, not only to their detriment, but to our collective detriment. We know that, for example, that Kung flu and China Wuhan virus have in many ways informed the violence that's unfortunately happening against Asian Americans, including some of the practitioners, as we're hearing, you know, some of the cases against students, you know, from MPD and from elsewhere that have been happening here in the district, some of the cases of harassment and bigotry. But sometimes I'm left with the question that if we had connected these dots differently, if we had helped the public to understand what we as Asian Americans take for granted in terms of how our bodies are racialized and how our cultures are sometimes exoticized here in the US, could we have fought against the tide of anti-Asian violence in a different sort of way? And maybe could we have a different kind of result? I mean, maybe these questions, you are not able to be answered in a satisfying way, and maybe that's for another panel. But for now, I wanted to commend the panel today for taking on this important discussion about inclusion. It's something very on brand for a kind of domestic discussion. It's very kind of a sexy topic that many people are talking about these days. Especially within a domestic context. So I'm intrigued about how your international inflection will approach this topic. But I'll just say for us, for my agency, it's something that we push ourselves to think about every day. At the risk of dating myself and proving my academic vintage in the 90s in graduate school, I've often thought about this through the lens of Robert Putnam's social capital ideas about internal bridging and thinking about building inclusivity within the AAPI umbrella, how to engage Pacific Islanders, how to engage, cultures that come to the US from across the Pacific Rim, to external bridging, where we think about our counterparts at the Mayor's Office of Latino Affairs or LGBTQ Affairs or Veterans Affairs, and how our constituents as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders build social capital and build community and build our city really with and among these diverse communities. In closing then, I just wanted to wish you all a productive and enlightening conversation. I hope that you're able to take these ideas and talking points that are presented here and help convert them into change that makes has a real effect in people's lives here in the district and across all of the diasporas that we move in. Thanks again for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to listening. So thanks again.
Thanks so much for your very thoughtful opening remarks. I think, many things that you've just mentioned, I'm sure we'll be discussing with our panelists today, issues of diaspora, inclusion, discrimination against the AAPI and so forth. I'm sure all of these will be the points of discussion for today's panel. And I would like to also thank you for all the things that you do at your office. Thank you so much for giving that wonderful opening remarks. Now I would like to move on to introducing our panelists today. In order to save enough time for discussion, I'll not go over the longer version of our panelists' bio, so please refer to them in our program. So first, Patricia Chu is a professor of English and the deputy chair of the Department of English at the George Washington University. Second, Pawan Dhingra is a professor of American Studies and faculty equity and inclusion officer at Amherst College. Third, Audrey Pan is a community organizer and programs associates at OCA and GH. Next, Riz Rong is the program associate for the Kissinger Institute on China in the US at the Wilson Center. Haejun Seo is a master's student of Asian Studies at the Eliot School of International Affairs at GW. And finally, but not least, Daphne Lee is a New York-based journalist covering food and culture. I would like to begin with this question. So I would like our panelists to describe their work, research, and or projects you're currently engaged in, and how does your current work intersect with your own identity formation and experiences. And in addition to that, I would also like to ask about inclusiveness. So what it means to you personally, and how have different understandings or usages of that term lead to conflicts in your experience. If you could talk about inherent biases or any challenges or triumphs that you've come across, that would be great. All right, so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our panelists. Maybe I'd like to start with you, Patty.
Thanks to Jisoo and to Richard for organizing and inviting us here. I wanted to, I'll just sort of name the fact that I may be the oldest person here and one of the early scholars in Asian American studies. So that is explaining the work that I recently did in terms of inclusion, issues of inclusion. So the book I published in 2019, Asian American Narratives Return, was designed to address 3 founding biases in the field of Asian American studies, which I'll list and then explain. 1, a bias against the studies of immigrants who were somewhat marginalized by early scholars as Asian, not Asian American, as the early scholars focused on the writings of the American born. And I feel, as I speak, you'll see that this connects with the things that Richard just brought up of silos. 2, a bias against intellectual and elite immigrants who were depicted as numerically less significant and presumed by early scholars to fit the category of compliant Asians, now designated model minorities, and presumed to be indifferent to working class people, in part because their activities in the homelands were obscured by the early scholars' focus on activities in the national United States. 3, there was a presumption of competition and separation between the immigrant generation and the American-born generation, with the desire to foreground the concerns of the American-born. So the explanation is that the term Asian American was coined as part of a movement to claim citizenship, cultural belonging, and social justice for Asians in America. The writers, scholars, and activists of the early Asian American movement still remembered how immigrant Japanese had been unable to apply for US citizenship before World War II and had been incarcerated as enemy aliens, even though many of them had been here for decades, and their children, American-born citizens, had been incarcerated with them as non-aliens, not as citizens, as non-aliens. In publishing, this is in the 60s and early 70s, Asian American writers found they were not accepted as Americans with Asian cultural roots, and their work was marginalized. So the presumption that US citizens were white or maybe Black and people with Asian looks were foreign was something that had to be counteracted. And of course, Latinx people were also presumed to be foreign. The Asian American movement did so by focusing on the stories of those in America and denying the significance to migrants' cultures and experiences in their countries of origin. Now, like many of my students here at George Washington University, I grew up in a white neighborhood. There was no such thing as multiculturalism, let alone an Asian American consciousness in Pittsburgh until the 1980s, after I had left. My immigrant parents were Chinese. I was both Chinese and Chinese American, and they and their friends, professors and engineers, exemplified Chinese culture and identity for us kids. Neither in high school nor in college did I ever hear or use the term Asian American or read any Asian American authors. There were courses in Chinese and history and Mandarin. I happened to go to college at Yale, very lucky, so it was wonderful, but no courses in Asian American anything. Only when I was living in New York did I meet a creative writing instructor who asked, why is there no Asian American literary tradition? It was a fabulous question. When I went back to grad school in English, I decided to find out. I entered a terrific graduate program at Cornell, but at that time, the university also didn't offer any courses in Asian American history, literature, or culture. I was given space and funding to research and define Asian American literature and to teach one of the first courses in that field that was given there. While I was there, Professor Lee C. Lee, a psychology professor, campaigned for an Asian American program and hired a leading historian, Professor Gary Okuhiro, who's one of the founders of the Association for Asian American Studies. Gary created the Asian American program at Cornell and also created the term East of California to welcome singular self-trained scholars of Asian American studies who were working under isolated conditions at universities all over the country that did not acknowledge the existence of Asian American studies as a legitimate and significant field, or I would even go further and say the existence of Asian Americans as a constituency. So part of teaching Asian American literature in any school east of California, which is most of the country, is that you have to counteract the institutional erasure of Asian American studies as an intellectual field and Asian Americans as a constituency, whether among students, faculty, staff, alumni, or parents. So to reiterate, most people are not born, raised, and educated as Asian Americans. We're born and raised in families that identify with a specific country or region of origin. One becomes an Asian American by a process of education in which one recognizes the culture's imposition of the Asian racial category on people of different countries and ethnic origins, and accepting this label as a politically necessary category. Not all Asian Americans consider themselves Asian American. We want to respect that, but also welcome and include them. Second, there's an unresolved contradiction in this category between the legitimate need to create a space where Asian Americans are recognized as truly American and the equally important need to recognize and include immigrants and their cultural roots and identifications with other countries as part of the Asian American community and their story. Institutionally, we should discuss the implications of including all Asians within Asian Americans when we're counting faculty or students, for instance, which results in masking the dearth of Asian American faculty in the humanities or in the absence, or masking the absence of the less advantaged groups who aren't represented. Third, I want to see the recognition of the importance of early immigrants, particularly writers, who had to work with different discursive constraints rather than the simplistic and ahistorical dismissal of those generations as model minorities. Recall, the model minority label was created in the 1960s, along with the term Asian American, and that includes serious understanding of educated immigrants, including, for instance, merchant families and those like my parents who came to the US to study, some of who returned and some stayed. It also includes those who have multiple roots or those who move between the US and other countries, whom we might call expatriates or flexible citizens. So people of different degrees of investment here need to be recognized, but it needs to be, I think, theorized and expressed in institutional work. And finally, as Ben indicated, there's more to say about which ethnic and national groups get and should have discursive space under the banner of Asian American, which at GW is kind of very small in terms of discursive space. So I'll pause there and thank you.
Thank you, Patty, for sharing your thoughts and also your contribution to building Asian American studies here. And also here at GW, she recently created a minor in Asian American studies, which will begin this fall. That's just so great. Thanks for your contribution. All right, next, Pawan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to be here with all of you and for bringing us together. It's great to see people I know and also meet new people. And thank you for those who are participating and taking time out of your day. So I'm going to pick up on a lot of what Patty said because she has been a trailblazer in Asian American studies, and I've benefited as a scholar in Asian American studies from her and other trailblazers. In fact, I went to Cornell after she was there, and I benefited from Gary Okihiro and other professors that she mentioned. So in East California, all the things. And part of what Patty was getting at is some of the gaps in the field of Asian American studies. For instance, even though most Asian Americans get identified as a model minority, and that's the dominant stereotype we have of Asian Americans, which we can deconstruct, quite easily, I hope. Asian American studies as a field, ironically, has not focused on them as a significant site as much as we may think. And then if you don't do that academically, you leave open kind of conversations about them to public figures like, Amy Chua and tiger parenting becomes the way we talk about it rather than anything really sophisticated. So I'm getting back to your question about my current research and how it ties to inclusiveness and these current themes. My most recent book is called Hypereducation: Why Good Schools, Good Grades, and Good Behavior Are Not Enough. And it looks at the so-called tiger parent, right? All these Asian parents who are really committed to education for their kids. And we can talk, we probably have personal narratives around this. And even if we don't, we know people who do, where our parents or ourselves, we really double down on education for our kids or in our own upbringing, because that's kind of the main means for mobility. And so it's not just enough to get good grades, you need to go to school after school. And we're seeing a lot of this, these cram schools or, after school centers or academic competitions. So look around at the national competitions we see for academics. The most popular is the Scripps National Spelling Bee. And if you know anything about the Scripps National Spelling Bee, you know that Indian kids dominate it. Look at the science competitions and everything else. This, this trend, right, is something quite meaningful. Of course, it obscures a lot of truths in Asian American among, inequalities in education, challenges, language challenges, and the like that are really pronounced. But at the same time, unless we talk about this trend and understand what's going on behind it, we do leave, unless we do that, then the public conversation about this becomes about tiger parenting and really kind of crude stereotypes. So my book explains why do Asian American parents care so much about education, and how ironically, educators, teachers, and principals and guidance counselors actually resent it when kids perform really well in school. And this gets at the theme of inclusiveness. So what does it mean to be included? What is inclusiveness? My reaction to that question is, well, it depends on what you're being included into, right? Inclusiveness can be great. It could also be quite a problem. If the culture you're being included into is one that does not adequately recognize or respect your background, your race, your learnings, your teachings, then being included into that culture, right, could actually mean losing things that you care about and having to conform to something that you find quite problematic. Under those circumstances, inclusiveness can be actually understood as a form of violence. I think we should pay attention to that and not just praise inclusiveness as inherently a good thing, right? Because it may not be. We should realize that real inclusiveness means that cultures of, whether it be schools, higher education, politics, the law, anything, right, are willing to change in order to grow as the people they serve and their members are more diverse. So as diversity grows, inclusiveness should be elastic in its understanding so that we can actually create communities and spaces that really have full belonging. In the education sphere, I'll end with this, in high schools, elementary schools, middle schools, inclusiveness does not just mean having Asian Pacific Heritage Month, right? It means something much more than that. We're just realizing that white privilege and white normativity, as I call it in my book, kind of pervade what it means to be a good student, right? And so Asian Americans can be critiqued for being too good at times, right? And they're told to calm down in their educational progress, which is astounding to me, because when the roles are reversed, when white students outperform students of color, which is very common across our schools, right? That's never what you hear white parents being told. White parents are never told to calm down. Instead, Black and brown parents are told to catch up and change and become more like the white kids. This white normativity, right, is taken for granted. And inclusiveness into that could be a problem. So I challenge us to really ask, what are we being included into? And is that something we actually should be changing in order to create more equality for everybody?
Thank you so much. I think I think there are many things to discuss as our discussions move forward. I think many of us, especially Asian and Asian Americans here, can relate so much to why there's so much focus on education and really what inclusivity means in that context. I think we'll have plenty of things to discuss going forward. All right, thank you, Pawan. Next, Audrey.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm so deeply humbled to be on this panel with all of you. I differ from the other panelists here in that I will be speaking from the perspective as a community organizer and the work that I do with our young Asian American people here in Texas. So at OCA Greater Houston, I'm an organizer and programs associate. And just as a quick synopsis of the organization, we are a national member-driven civil rights organization of community advocates dedicated to advancing the social, political, and economic well-beings of Asian Americans. And we were established in 1979. And Greater Houston is one of the OCA's National's 100 plus chapters and college affiliates. And we have a track record of programs and initiatives that work to advance 4 main goals, which are to advocate for social justice, equal opportunity and fair treatment, to promote civic participation, education, and leadership, to advance coalitions and community building, and to also foster cultural heritage. And really our goal is to ensure that the next generation has a quote unquote seat at the table, and that we have representation on all levels of business, government, and community leadership, and to also encourage long-term civic participation, education, and engagement for Asian Americans in the Greater Houston area. So at Greater Houston, I have the privilege to work with our Asian young people to really develop their skills that they need to mobilize their communities and to also deepen their political analysis to enact fundamental social change. And it's been in this role that I've been able to see firsthand the power of grassroots organizing as a vehicle to yield social change. And for me, grassroots organizing really is about allowing the most marginalized in our communities, so meaning young people, queer people, undocumented folks within the Asian American community, to talk directly about their personal experiences, to collectively affect change at the local, regional, national, and even international level. And really organizing is about improving the conditions of communities, and specifically low-income immigrant communities of colors, communities in which I am intertwined with. So with my youth specifically, I'm really glad that we have a panelist full of academics, because a lot of the work that I do as an organizer is actually reading theory and also making sure that I am well informed in Asian American literature, history, etc. So that way I can transfer knowledge onto my students. Our greatest project right now that we're focusing on is actually pushing for Asian American studies in public school curricula, which I know a lot of states have been focusing on, and would be really, I hope that we can have that discussion in this panel as well, like how we can continue this movement of pushing for Asian American studies within curricula in either higher ed or within high schools. So we know that Asian American studies and identity exploration are not taught in traditional high school curricula, especially here in Texas, which is a deeply conservative state still. And so at OCA, we really educate our students in Asian American studies to provide students the opportunity to examine our Asian American history, which includes diverse amounts of topics such as immigration, cultural practices, race-based exclusion policies, hate crimes, etc. And this history really opens up space for our youth to engage in critical dialogue with one another, to reflect on their own personal histories. And really the point of learning this history is so that our youth become empowered by historical moments where marginalized people spoke up to fight against racism, hate, white supremacy, whether it's directed towards our community or onto others. And we also know that these topics are often left out of traditional curricula, and our students are really craving this space where they can talk amongst other youth who are in the same life stage as them, and also asking the same questions. And we know that we oftentimes hear students say, oh, it's not until I got to college where I took my first Asian American studies, or I began to have my first critical dialogue about race. And so we wanted to start much younger, knowing that our young people want to be active within social movements, and that our young Asian American youth are yearning to learn more, especially in this age where they're on social media, they're watching the news, and so much information is coming out, and they're just trying to understand what is happening, and also where they are situated in this world based on their racialized identity. And so for me, this work is really grounded by the beautiful but also fraught history of Asian American activism and organizing. And it's really to ensure that our students have an understanding of who they are and can more wisely build a future of student organizers, and know that they are continuing a legacy that many activists and political members have started years ago. And so for me, I think my work is really divided up into two sections, where it's educating our Asian American young people and also young students who are not Asian Americans on Asian American history, and also transferring this history and knowledge into action, which for a lot of our students for so many years have been saying, we don't see ourselves reflected in traditional curricula. Why is that? And so really moving into more of a policy and advocacy focused lens. So that way we are pushing for representation, diversity, and inclusivity within traditional high school curricula.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for all the work that you do and your contribution to immigration communities of color. I totally support, including Asian American studies in high school curricula. I think this is, again, I think all part of inclusivity. Thank you. All right, next, Ree?
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation, GWU. This is a really interesting sort of mixture of different types of experts and specialists. So my name is Ray. I work at the Wilson Center as a program associate in our China program. And I specialize in looking at technology and business relations between China and the US, policy implications of that, and how nationalism factors into this, because neither the United States nor China as they exist today are politically neutral actors. They have interests, they enact policy to focus on those interests, and those policies impact, different people and communities. Also, I'm from Wuhan, so I've had quite the 2020 and 2021, as you may imagine. So my work really focuses on looking at policies, but in that context, inclusiveness really means sort of examining different types of systems and how they function. So to me, this means a couple of core questions. Who makes policy? Who gets impacted by policy? And what are people willing to give up to make changes in different types of policy? So for instance, just to give you an example, we have the 2022 Winter Olympics hosted by Beijing coming up. China is facing questions from NGOs, human rights activists on the use of forced labor within prisons in Xinjiang. And so the types of questions that an organization like NBC, one of the biggest broadcasters of the Olympics, is how are you going to approach this issue that you've traditionally profited off of, and make the decisions that take into account the policy stakes between China and the United States. Similarly, nothing in US-China policy happens in a vacuum. There is different levels of interactions. We have the state to state, so China's foreign ministry and the US State Department. We also have people to people. And far more recently, as it relates to the violence facing Asian diaspora communities, how civilians interact with law enforcement and the issues of crime and violence. And so all these types of systems and different types of events that occur within the interlocked US and Chinese systems, those are all issues that I tend to examine on day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Over the past year, obviously, COVID has taken up a lot of bandwidth in policy because it has colored so much of labor, economics, public health, and of course, diplomacy. Over the weekend, the United States faced criticism in slowness in responding to a vaccine and raw materials shortage in India. Whereas China, throughout the course of the pandemic, has been both, people have been paying attention to its vaccine diplomacy and PPE diplomacy, but also those have been commercial opportunities for China as well. And also China's own COVID narrative has some question marks on what it includes and what it omits. I recently just ran an article with the Wilson Quarterly, our in-house magazine, that really discusses the types of political amnesia, which ranges from the ways that Chinese state actors censored the COVID outbreak in Wuhan, but also some critical points on how American governments have been very selective about what has been communicated throughout the crisis. So I'm happy to drop that in the chat for anybody who's interested in taking a look at it. So just to sort of go back to inclusiveness, to me, it really does come down to the three questions: who makes policy, who gets impacted by policy, and what are people willing to give up or pay in order to do things differently than how we've done so in the past.
Thank you so much, Ray. I mean, you're for reminding us the importance of policy. Actually, I mean, devising policies is definitely a critical factor here in terms of really enhancing our inclusivity, because that's the only way to really improve, right? Okay, next, Haejun.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at the event. I am truly grateful to share my experiences to develop awareness of Asian and Asian American inclusivity. So I am a student at Asian Studies MA student at GW Elliott School, and I'm also a news producer at the Washington, D.C. Bureau of Korean Broadcasting System, also known as KBS. Today, I want to focus on the views that I see through the lens of my personal experiences and through the media. So growing up, I resonated with the culture that my parents originated from, and I didn't want to let go of that part of me living in the United States. So I searched for opportunities where I could utilize my ability to relate to different cultures and speak two languages. And having such an advantage of knowing two cultures encouraged me to become someone who can bridge the gap between the two different cultures together. So currently, I work with correspondents from South Korea who are here for only about 2 to 3 years. And I advise them on what to be cautious about and help them understand with respect to cultural differences in the process of producing news segments. And as a news producer, I had a chance to visit places to coordinate in-depth reports and meet the locals to hear more about their stories. And as I delved into diverse news, I feel that I am building onto the subjectivity of my cultural perceptions. And in terms of how inclusiveness means personally, I would say that it has to begin with acceptance of my own cultural identity. And on a personal note, I personally struggled with my own identity because I had no sense of belonging. I felt like I didn't fit anywhere. It was always along the boundary of being Korean or American, which sometimes led me to self-dissatisfaction and sometimes even confusion. But I realized, that's a fact that will not change and something I need to embrace and live with. So I'm sure that's something that we Asian and Asian Americans could relate to. And also that's why we need to promote more inclusiveness. And I like to share what I've experienced during my high school years. I grew up in Queens, New York, where many immigrants moved to settle down, and the place is the definition of the melting pot. So growing up, students gathered by their own race and bonded only with a certain group of people because they were able to, I guess, relate more comfortably and deeply through their cultural connections. So I also hung out mostly with Asians, giving myself that excuse that I can't relate to Western jokes. And when I moved to Long Island, New York, I was one of the only 12 Asian and Asian American students. And even in that setting, I rarely found myself among the other groups, but only sticking with Asian groups. And I started to see that pattern where other groups were also formed by their own race. And I believe this is one of the most common inherent biases in our community, where we just jump to the conclusion that we're different and disregard our similarities. And just to share my personal experience, in order to challenge such a stereotype in my final year of high school, I introduced a Korean movie soundtrack to my orchestra team that I was part of to perform in our last concert, hoping to, bring harmony of cultures. And even though the audience was not familiar with the music, people truly enjoyed the performance. It was kind of, all these small events that I experienced made me optimistic that a wide inclusiveness of Asian and Asian American is definitely achievable when we make our voices heard.
Thank you so much. I think you really made an important point about being able to accept one's own culture, but also others' cultural identity. So thanks for mentioning that. Next, we'll move on to Daphne.
Thank you, Jisoo, and thank you for having me here today. I'm a freelance journalist based in New York, and I mainly write about food and entertainment. And I often use these topics to provide context on Asian American history, cultural stereotypes, racism, and microaggressions. And I do often write in a first person voice to just acknowledge my own background and my own biases in my own reporting. And it also gives me a chance to use myself as a source in my stories. So I guess a little background about myself will make it easier to connect with my identity. So I was born in Hong Kong, grew up in New York, and I always felt this instinct to like hide my Asianness to assimilate to the US. So like what Hejun said, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. So there was definitely like a sense of disconnect between me and my hometown. But I ended up working in Taiwan for almost 2 years, going back to Hong Kong frequently to kind of re-explore my roots. And I got to cover Taiwan's election, the Hong Kong protest, and then the food scene, the cinema, etc. And then I came back to New York last year in the middle of the pandemic to be closer to my family. And then I realized I had to shift gears very quickly because writing about Asian food and culture for the American audience requires a very drastically different lens. And we often have to like dumb down our writing just so it's easier for the general audience to understand what it is. And then it's even harder to pitch or convince an editor that our stories matter and they are interesting to read. But I was like lucky enough to work with editors who pushed me to write more about the representation of Chinese American cuisine in the US. So from researching the evolution of our cuisine, I learned much more about Asian American history, its nuances, which is something I wasn't taught in school. And I think for me as a journalist, using topics with mass appeal like food, a popular dish, a popular TV show to tell stories about our community is one of the most effective ways to get outsiders to hear us and engage with us. And to discuss inclusiveness, I think for me professionally, inclusiveness in my field means not being required to go extra lengths to justify the importance of our story. So almost always, POC editor is going to be a lot more invested, more supportive of my work and like giving me more creative freedom and a higher degree of trust instead of holding my hands through the process. But there's this unspoken barrier between me and white editors who always like to ask, but why are you qualified to write about this? Even when I'm pitching something from like my own culture and things that I've written before. So I think this shows how important it is for inclusivity to be about putting people of color in directive positions instead of just giving them a seat at the table. So a lot of times I think companies think of diversity and inclusivity as just hiring people of color, Asian Americans who look better statistically, or publishing these writers to fulfill a kind of quota. But do we ever ask people in management position, leadership position, what diversity looks like to them? Would they actually entrust people of color or Asian Americans with the power and influence within the structure? So I think it's important to carve out a space for us to tell stories, but we also need people in editorial roles, management roles who know how to empower other people of color so that we don't only discuss this topic when it's sexy, when it's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, or when there's a shooting. So this is something that I think we need to talk about in an upper management level.
Thank you, Daphne. I think you really, got to the point that, inclusiveness means we don't really have to go extra mile to do something, right, for people of color. I think this, nicely relates to our next question that we've prepared for this panel. So related to this inclusiveness, what do you identify as critical gaps, structural flaws, or strengths to Asian American inclusion and equity And how are your respective fields addressing these critical issues? And if not, what would you suggest should be done? And as you know, today we have prepared this panel discussion, including academics, policymakers, and people in the media field. We want to also ask this question of what would be effective ways to collaborate among these different fields and community organizing to improve Asian and Asian American inclusivity. Okay, back to you, Patty.
I think one of the most important ideas has already been brought up, I think, by Audrey, which is to include Asian American literature and history in K through 12 education, because only a fraction of the population ever goes to college or completes college. And so there has to be a sense that this is part of the American story. So that would be my main feeling in the culture at large. Of course, there's much to say about the media, and I will let others who are working in the media say that. I think in the institution, I really love what you are doing, Jisoo, which is bringing in not properly Asian topics into these discussions. And I would love to see more of that in general and at GW, where I think it's a moment when it's very hard to get a slot to hire a full-time faculty member, unless it's something that is already institutionalized as important or as lucrative in our organization. So, and any opening of space in existing spaces to say, hey, you know, Chinese Americans are part of Chinese history. We need to talk about how Asians interact with the other minority groups and put that into our account of American history or American studies. All these kinds of small interactions can, I think, eventually build to better institutionalization. I want to say also that although that I want to comment on the problem of narrative scarcity. People have said to me in the course of the past year, well, what about some coverage of Taiwan, Taiwanese Americans? What about, how come there are no Asian American courses that mention South Indians? What about more coverage of Filipinos? And of course, the question of inclusion of Pacific Islanders is very complicated, right? Who counts as a Pacific Islander? And those issues are very, very different. So that leads me to the problem of narrative scarcity, right? So if I'm only teaching 2 semesters of courses, how will I have time to unfold all of that, all of those issues? How will I have time to research them if I'm only one person or there are a handful of other people? So narrative scarcity in the academy is lack of faculty slots, lack of money to hire adjuncts and visiting professors. And in the library, I think, although it may sound kind of extravagant, but I cannot teach about another culture unless you read 10 or 12, 20 books, right? Going to visit the culture, the place is even better. But if you read 10 or 20 books before you visit the place, you will see something more and different when you go there. So if I would, read one book about Korean Americans and say, oh, I'm going to teach that, that would be good, but it would be better if I read 20 books about Korean Americans and say, which of these books do I need for this? And maybe now I've read a bunch of books, I understand the connections, the history in which to read a particular book. So the problem of narrative scarcity in our own reading, in our own libraries, and in the structure of the academy needs to be addressed. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Patty. Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you brought up this narrative of scarcity. our department, our history department as a whole, we're actually revisiting our syllabi, and then trying to really include what we've left out for our students to read, especially scholars from a POC, or also how to really include more of diverse voices in our classrooms. I think we have a lot to talk related to narrative of scarcity here at higher education.
Right.
Next, Pan.
Yeah, thank you. And as before, I'll pick up on what Patty was getting at, which is in terms of the academy, right? I think we always want more faculty dedicated to a specific research and teaching area. But as Patty mentioned, that's very hard to come by nowadays. And so you really can't expect there to be a triple fold of if faculty hired to teach Asian American studies. Would love that, but it's just you can't hold your breath for that. So I think inclusivity, the gaps in the academy around Asian American studies or Asian American Pacific Islanders in general, right? Partly it's the curriculum, but it's also all the other elements of what it means to be in higher education. So for instance, are the diversity office, right? Are AAPIs understood as a key constituent within diversity work, right? I don't take that for granted actually in many places. And so that's an office that needs to be recognizing the significance of APIs. Are counseling centers on campus, are they realizing the needs of Asian Americans? Are they adequately staffed? Because we know that Asian Americans, our mental health concerns go underreported and underrecognized, but they're very significant. And we need a lot of attention in this regard, especially, everywhere, but higher ed is a key place for this, right? Are we able to, are our organizations, student organizations and elsewhere, getting the resources that they need, not just compared to other organizations, but also to compensate for the lack of education that they're getting on their own backgrounds, given the fact that, as Patty was saying, there's not enough faculty hired to teach in these fields, right? So you got to see those two things as connected. And then we shouldn't just see a curriculum on Asian Americans as people who teach on Asian American studies, right? Faculty who teach in a wide range of fields can be encouraged to include more on Asian Americans, whether teaching a course on immigration or a course, on American literature or whatever else, right? Like there's many ways it should be fit into and broaden the curriculum as opposed to just a singular course on one racial group, or as Patty was saying, an ethnic group or sub-ethnic group, which often get lost in this, right? And then hopefully seeing connections between what Asian American studies can offer and other ethnic studies programs. So as you were saying, Audrey, right, getting ethnic studies in the high school level is critical. It's happening in California right now. I know Connecticut is working on such things. It's happening, in different pockets at the state level, right? And one thing I'd like to see is something kind of basically the reverse of the former President Trump's 1776 commission, right? He created this commission to kind of like celebrate the greatness of American history and American exceptionalism across all these different spaces across the country. Maybe we could imagine something quite different from that, right? Where there's a commission around America's commitment, investment in white supremacy, right? I'd love to see how that gets revealed at higher ed, but also at K through 12, at state parks, right? At wherever there's all these different locations that the federal government runs and our educational spaces, public libraries, right? Let's think about a commission in that regard. And so that's outside of higher ed, but obviously it fits within the broader framework of education. And so I think there's a lot of gaps that can be filled at different levels.
Thank you, Pawan. I think, all the more it demands collaboration among different institutions to really resolve or to improve this issue. Okay, next, Audrey.
Yeah, I think this idea of diversity and inclusion, which are like, again, echoing what everyone has said, very sexy terms. What I've noticed is that oftentimes a lot of institutions, companies, or organizations set the stage for having diversity first, and then they scramble to create inclusion programs. And unfortunately, what I've seen is that this always puts an undue burden on minority employees and students who have been tasked with either learning or adapting to non-inclusive environments. And so often I have students always coming to me saying that they are taking on extra work, quote unquote, outside of school in order to educate their teachers even, or other students or other administrators within their schools about their racialized identity, about Asian American history, et cetera, their experiences as students. And this is more work that they're taking on in addition to all of the subjects that, and all of their schoolwork, and all their club works that they're already, that they're a part of. And it also places an immense amount of responsibility for students and for also employees that are beyond what their positions or their jobs are called for. And so, you know, it affects our students' like performances, efficiency, longevity within schools and also within organizations as well. And so I think that diversity and inclusion means nothing if the system isn't equitable, again, which is why I think that community organizing plays such an important role in this conversation of how can we create more equitable structures so that we can even then have a conversation around inclusion and diversity. Equity within any space, whether it's school or at a workplace or in an institution, really starts with understanding that there are underlying and often unacknowledged biases and structural inequality built into organizations and institutions that favor some groups of people over others. And furthermore, equity is also acknowledging the role that systemic privilege plays in success, right, for some folks over other folks. And so really when I'm working with students, I'm thinking about, you know, how can we create more equitable structures within the school system and outside of the school system, and what role can they play in organizing to fight for more equitable structures? And so again, mentioning the work that we're doing right now to push for K through 12 Asian American studies and ethnic studies within public school curricula, you know, that is going to be a long fight for our students. And by the time we're even getting onto that, right now we're just setting the foundation, right? Contacting teachers and talking to them about why this is important to teach in their classrooms. Talking to teachers who oftentimes tell me like, hey, we don't have enough time to teach that because it's not going to be tested in standardized testing, you know, almost convincing teachers to be like, even though it's not being tested right now, this is still important for the students that you work with. And so again, this fight is really continuing this legacy of work that so many activists, Asian American activists and organizers started so long ago. And telling my students that, you know, while we're working towards that currently, I want them to also reimagine a different kind of structure within our own youth programming. And so for a lot of them, my job as an organizer is to ask them to create a system in which they want to see, you know, in the future, in their own schools, colleges, and whatever careers that they decide to go into. And so within our own work, I always tell them that the goal of inclusion is to address full participation, to actualize diversity. You know, we can't talk about diversity without talking about inclusion first, and making sure that there are equitable structures that foster full participation for all members in that group. And so my students, I always want them to think about how we can be strategic in talking about inclusion, and that inclusion is really rooted in our identity and in our values as a group. And so while we're fighting for this K through 12 Asian American Studies curricula, I also asked them that within our own youth programming to reimagine what kind of structure they would want to see outside of this youth programming. And so I think the work that I do with students, I'm always asking them, who is in this room, who is not, who are we leaving behind? So for example, in Texas, a lot of folks don't know, but undocumented Asian Americans is the fastest growing undocumented group in the US. And oftentimes we leave them behind. Organizations don't do outreach to this group, and therefore they don't receive legal services, et cetera. And so I throw in the question, like, who is in this room and who isn't? Which identities do we value over others? You know, out of our students, who identifies as Asian American and who doesn't? And even if they don't, how can we continue to include them in our work? Because whether or not they identify as such, the work that we do still affects them. And so for me, at the end of the day, I've done my job as an organizer if my students can walk away curious and have developed a critical lens to not only question whether or not inclusion is in their own personal life, but in all the spaces that they are a part of. And so while we're doing all this work on the policy end and advocacy avenue, that is going to take a very long time. I also ask them to question existing structures in their own lives and to create and imagine different structures than the one that already exists within our own programming, so that they can see that these things are possible.
Right, thanks, Audrey. I think it relates to Daphne's point about really having to do extra work for POC when we're really building this equitable structure. Okay, next, Rui.
So I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that within Asian America and Asian diaspora communities, there's a subset of people who are far more at risk. And I want to refer specifically to the victims of the March 2021 shootings in Atlanta salons. And so this has really prompted a lot of soul searching in the weeks afterwards. And if I'm being quite honest, a salon worker today, more often than not, is not necessarily going to be on the same wavelength as someone like me who's working in a think tank on international relations. This is a problem. This is an inclusion problem. I think that for foreign policy, we have this definition of safety and security within the sort of international big picture context. Not that those problems aren't valid, but this often comes at the cost of really overlooking some of the communities here that are impacted, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, by the policy events that occur that sometimes we cross paths with. Our choices contribute to who is given power, what perspectives get elevated over time. And I think one question that I've seen asked over and over by practitioners is, what can we do? Oftentimes we have this type of sort of, I don't know, people trying to justify, China as a state actor really is, doing X, Y, and Z, which, it's true, but also as the weeks have passed since that attack, we've seen this return to this kind of ideological and values equilibrium where it's like, Chinese students are more likely to, do act a certain way, or, allegations that they're more likely to commit espionage, cheat, and other types of stereotypes levied on them. And I think that, in the long run, this is still going to be a price that the broader Asian community pays as a cost for us to sort of keep doing things a certain way. And so I think that given the inclusion problems in IR, it's not just, staffing, although it's always good to see more and more people, working their way up research, administration, and leadership. But at the end of the day, what kind of mark are we as foreign policy practitioners leaving on in America, the home that we have? And so I think that's an inclusion question I think really needs to get addressed more.
Thank you, Rui. I think we have one question from our audience related to inclusion problem in IR, so I'll ask you that question later on. All right, next, Haejun.
Yes, first, I like to lay out a concern that I see in terms of in the media. I see there's a lot of people that don't view this issue as a lack of inclusiveness, but rather as a dispute or even a competition between races. Where I'm coming from is the recent Asian hate crimes, especially I'm focusing on the Korean Americans being harassed. they're mostly portrayed as if they're being harassed mainly by African Americans in the media, which worries me because that could possibly be another type of bias against African Americans, and such type of portrayal in the media could, raise not only biases but also misunderstanding of the main issue. And I also want to strongly emphasize that you should not let the media take up your entire judgment. Like what you see in the media report is only a portion of the problem, and you should focus on how we as Asian and Asian Americans should be included, and how we should be raising our voices to stand up for our sense of belonging simply as someone who consider the United States as home. And as other panelists also mentioned, I want to focus on educating Asian American history more broadly. Recently, Korean media has been raising this issue of comfort women due to this inaccurate publication by Harvard Law School professor falsely stating that comfort women were voluntary sex slaves. And in order to cover this story in detail, my colleagues and I visited Harvard to hear more about how Harvard students think about this issue. And some of them are, they refused to comment because they didn't want to be on TV. But I was surprised to hear that many of them didn't want to interview because, they lack a lack of knowledge on the historical background. And I believe that raising such historical awareness could play a significant role in Asian and Asian American inclusiveness, and it could be used as one of the methods to address these loopholes seen in modern society. And I think that ignorance could lead to serious consequences for our future generations.
Thank you. Thanks for raising that, that important point about the media's representation of not just hate crime, but also other things. I think it is really dangerous to, to be just thinking that it's just solely African Americans. Obviously, it is not, and I think that's really, something we really have to open our eyes and see, and really do more serious thoughts about these issues. And actually, it is our institute's mission to really educate our students and the community about these kind of historical awareness that you just talked about. Thank you. Daphne?
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with what Hae-Jun just said. We shouldn't base our judgment entirely based on media coverage. That is mainly because Asian Americans only make up about 3% of workforce, the total workforce in newsrooms. And then so as a result, we don't get a lot of representation of Asian American community in media. And then a lot of younger Asian Americans have actually turned to Asian focused websites like Nick Shark, subtle Asian traits on Facebook, Asian feed on Instagram, to find like the sense of community, because the mainstream media narrative has largely excluded this community from the mainstream narrative. So, and also as a result, American newsrooms are very unprepared to cover a national story about Asian American community. So take the Atlantic Spa shooting as an example. Newsrooms were scrambling to look for freelancers who spoke Korean to cover the crime and to speak to the victims' families. And then there were actually reports that Asian American journalists were excluded from covering the crime because they were probably too quote unquote biased or emotionally invested, that they wouldn't be able to do that job fairly. But imagine telling a white journalist that they can't cover the tax bill because their taxes are affected by it, So I feel like there's a sore misunderstanding that's ingrained by traditional journalism schools that we have to be neutral to be very detached from a story. But how genuine are we as reporters, and are we endorsing racism and violence by just staying neutral and impartial? So this is definitely like something that's also can be addressed by academia and how journalism schools are training people of color. And there's this like great example from the CNN correspondent, Natasha Chen. She brought up that when she interviews a grieving family member, she will always ask them, what would you say to that person if she's here now? So she asked the daughter of Xiao Jie Tian, one of the victims from the shooting, Jamie. She asked her what she would say to her mother if she was here now. And like a lot of people, she said, oh, I'll tell her I love her. But then there's more to that story, right? And as an Asian American, she could ask a follow-up question. You didn't say that a lot, did you? Like you didn't get to express that when she was alive. And like we understand how important that question is to our community because we know we don't say I love you to our parents a lot. And perhaps we show our affection differently through acts of service or just going home for dinner. But do we really understand like that kind of cultural nuances if we're not in the community ourselves? So I think the media really has to understand that you have to assign the right person to the right story, not only because we have the language facilities most of the time, but also because you understand those cultural nuances better.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it was really a great idea to invite our panelists from different fields, academia, policy, and the media. And I think all this, this interactive dialogue among these different fields, I find it very, very helpful and fruitful, and leads to fruitful discussions about inclusiveness that we are talking about here. So we received many interesting questions, and I don't think we'll be able to get to all the questions that we received, but I'll try to address as many questions as I can. I would like to begin this question from Brian Alvarez Terrazas, and he's asking something that I was recently made aware of is the fact that I, as a Latino, often talk about the Latino X identity in relation to whiteness, while very infrequently focusing on what whiteness is itself. And part of that is the fact that whiteness makes itself invisible and sets itself as the norm, that other underrepresented and underinvested communities have to identify themselves in relation to. What are your thoughts on this? I'll open it up to all of our panelists, and so please feel free to respond.
I think that Daphne just made a really good point about how news organizations just assume that Asian Americans would be biased in covering certain types of issues, and I think that ties in quite nicely to this question that in a lot of different aspects about politics, policy, especially foreign policy, there is this idea of the impartial American value, when in fact throughout history this is just not necessarily been the case. I think given the amount of and this is something that I think foreign policy is still very much trying to disentangle itself from. We were our field is rooted in certain colonial traditions in a way that, even today, as we're starting to unpack different types of history in, adding more people of color and people from the background, different backgrounds into foreign policy, like the idea of what type of values is our work field promoting. That is still the central question. And the idea of, mostly like white academics or practitioners having the most neutral American values, I think is a really, really big question that we need to interrogate further.
I would just quickly add, I think that's a great answer. I would just quickly add, this is to the question, this is actually what I was trying to get at in some ways when I was referencing this kind of white normativity in schools in my book, Hypereducation, where like what is taken for granted as normal is what the middle class local white population does. And that will vary by geography, right? In New England, it's gonna look different than it will in Alabama, it will look different than it's even in Texas, all the way around, right? So it's hard to talk about this in a generic way, okay? But, local elite, even this local middle class whites oftentimes get understood to be normal, right? So in the local, so the local matters in answering that question, but the visibility of other groups relative to that normal seems to be a general trend.
I think we can move on to next question by Diane Sang. I think it's relevant to what we've been talking about. Due to a history of war and persecution from their native countries, many Asian immigrant parents actively discourage their children from studying politics, participating in protests, running for office, or organizing their peers. Those pursuits are seen as useless, incapable of generating income, and even dangerous. How will the newer waves of Asian immigrant children and second generation Asians overcome this?
First of all, this is a really great question. I have seen it in my family and in other cases. It's this problem of the young person has to find their own way, right? So you have to find this balance between what you want to do to honor your parents' perceptions and needs, and what you can afford to do and what you want to do yourself. I would ask, as a parent, I would say, is there an actual danger? What is the reality here? And you need to reckon that. But as a teacher, I would say that sometimes it takes a long time to answer this question. It may take decades for you to come to this path, and you might come to it when you're ready. But if there's something that you want to do when you're young and you have other things you have to do for your family, you might still feed that on the way. Like you might have friends who do what you want to do, and eventually those friends may lead you to the way that you want to follow. You might learn things on the way, like maybe I'm gonna study to be a teacher for 10 years or a professor, but meanwhile during that time I can either spend more time in the library, or I could spend more time conversing with or going with spending time with my friends who are more activists, and I will learn that way. So you don't have to be completely committed to a course. Viet Nguyen, my colleague, has a PhD in literary scholarship, but he was a creative writer on the side, right? And there are a lot of creative writers who were recently corporate lawyers. Min Jin Lee and Monique Trong were corporate lawyers, and then turned to, in their case, their calling was for writing. And I know people who went through their 20s and 30s doing what they thought they needed to do, and then later in life, not necessarily very late in life, but later in life could come back to their other passion. I also think that if you have a choice between doing what you want to do, which is risky, and in this case, politically risky, and doing what you should do the risky thing first, because what if you get caught up in a career that is completely successful, but not what you want? How will you leave? Right? So it's easier to do that at the beginning, but it all depends on your individual circumstances, and you cannot blame yourself for responding to your particular needs and your particular family's needs.
And so to add on to that, I think from my own experience, I've been seeing a lot of second generation Taiwanese Americans or Hong Kong Americans who are actually going back to Taiwan and Hong Kong to fight for their mother countries or motherland. And they actually stay there in defiance of their parents. So a lot of Asian American parents would think like, oh, we spend so much effort and energy to bring you to this country, and now you're going back. Like, what's the point of all of that? But if you feel really strongly about politics or like doing something for your heritage, you will do it. And then I think like another aspect of this is, do we only contribute to inclusion and discourse by participating in politics? Like, do we actually have to go to protest ourselves? If you're not that kind of person who's like at a rally holding a banner and just screaming like and chanting, right? Like not everyone can be in that kind of role. So if you don't feel like you have to be in politics and you don't actually have that volition to be in it, you can find ways to bring that diversity, inclusion, and your identity into your own workplace, whether you're a lawyer, you're just a chef, or I know like a lot of people in like the food community is actually doing some kind of activism through food. So is politics the only way? I don't think so. So, but also don't listen to your parents, of course. Just like what Patricia said, like take the risky path, but just make sure that's something that you really want to do for yourself.
Yeah, something very quickly. Yeah, I get this question a lot from my students. And it's funny, I think a lot about this question myself personally as well. Like, I don't think my parents even know what I do. I think if I explained it to my parents, they would probably tell me something like, oh, that's not a real job, which I'm sure a lot of folks have experienced before, whether that is through a job or an internship. But I will say that I think the Asian American community is changing drastically, and there is a fire that is growing amongst our Asian American young people, which has been so amazing to see and watch, especially young students speaking up for the first time or for the 100th time. And I also think that we need to break down this narrative that Asian Americans never spoke up in the past before, or that we were less vocal because that was somehow a trait of our culture. I make that distinction to my students all the time, that there is a long history of activism and organizing within our Asian American community. Even the fact that we call ourselves Asian Americans, right? That is a political stance in itself, rooted in history. And I also tell my students that a lot of times, like our parents and our families, their reaction to perhaps not wanting to go down a specific career or speaking up is actually rooted in trauma. Trauma based off of a racist society that did not protect our parents and our ancestors. And back then, there were not nearly as many celebrities, politicians, media folks in our society who could uplift and protect Asian voices. And so our parents' silence perhaps was a means of survival and adaptation in a society in which there was no safety offered to them. And so I tell my students that you are in an era where you're changing the narrative for Asian Americans, and that you are part of a generation in which you are creating safety measures in a society in which we are protecting not only our own community, but other communities of colors, and also marginalized communities as well. And that a lot of times you just have to reassure your parents that you know what you're doing and that this is important to you. And I always tell them to reframe it as a question of, this is important to me. Can this be important to you too? I'm doing this for us, for our community, for the next generation. I feel like oftentimes when you use language like that, it really hits home for our families and parents. And that we also have to understand that our parents, perhaps they're scared, and perhaps they've been through many violent incidences or moments themselves, and that we just also hold their stories in mind and know that, perhaps visibility is a cost for our parents. And so I ask our students to think about, how can we hold this tension, right? Hold our parents' stories and their lived experiences, and perhaps their fear that is oftentimes rooted in trauma, in creating a society in which we are creating safety measures so that our people can thrive. And that we must do this in a collective way. And so I tell my students, like, you're not doing this work on your own, which is very scary and at times feels like, oh, I'm the only person speaking up in a classroom where I'm the only Asian person. That wherever they go, I hope that they can find community and support, and that they know that they're doing this work collectively.
Thank you all for excellent responses. I mean, I would definitely agree here, as saying that don't listen to your parents. But then I don't know whether I want to say that to my own son, who's in ninth grade right now. But he doesn't listen to me anyways, so I guess that's a good thing. All right, our next question is actually specifically directed to Director Guzman. Here the Gloria style asks, when sociologist William Peterson introduces the term model minority in 1966, it was used to refer to the Japanese Americans, stating that they have achieved success in America despite their marginalized status. This term was also used later to refer to all Asian Americans, disregarding the enormous diversity of the Asian diaspora and their differences in social, economic, backgrounds. How can we dispel the model minority myth while holding on to the momentum we have now? I believe that when the pandemic hit, it was this perpetual prejudice that made the people see us as foreigners, which led to violent attacks. Well, it looks like she is also a proud US Berkeley alumni. She says, "Go Bears."
As is Viet Nguyen, as I was mentioning in the chat. No, well, thank you for asking me this question. I feel like I'm poaching ground as a speaker, as opposed to just someone who is welcoming the space. I would say that actually, in some ways, Patricia and Audrey sort of pointed to opposite ends of this spectrum, right? On one hand, Audrey points to the need for inclusiveness, right? Like we need to think about marginalized voices. We need to recognize that, you know, the white supremacy as the underlying kind of dynamic which has pit Asian Americans against other communities of color historically as the model minority. Like, why aren't you doing as well as, you know, those people are over there, and that sort of thing. And at the same time, Patricia kind of has us thinking about kind of what's at the end, the other end of that pendulum, right? Like the Asian American studies focus on you know, that kind of, you know, the different kinds of communities as opposed to sort of more elite ends of our community that you're seeing now, right? You're seeing sort of more comfortable voices stretching their muscles in the advocacy space with like Chinese and other Asian American parents weighing in on affirmative action issues, right? So the Asian American kind of advocacy space and model minority discussions are becoming more nuanced in these kinds of discussions. But I think, you know, I mean, as an advocate, for me, thinking about, you know, the most, it's helpful to think about the most marginalized communities because no one else is helping them, is thinking about them often. And just as a slight detour, I think that points to another question that's sort of floating out there about equity in terms of the vaccinations. And I would just point to the intentional ways that people are trying to think about the inequities that are evident in the vaccination system, right? And trying to address them directly, recognizing that cookie cutter approaches don't fit everybody, right? So how are we trying to support India? How is the district trying to support seniors that are, you know, that are not getting vaccinated at the same rates as other people are? So I feel like intentionality and inclusivity are part of the answers for some of these questions about kind of marginalized communities. But those are just some of my thoughts. So thank you for letting me get involved.
Thank you. Anybody else from the panelists want to respond to this?
I'll just jump in quickly and say that I think it's a great question about how to dispel the model minority myth. I completely agree with the question that a lot of the violence that we're seeing in, you know, throughout the year in New York, Atlanta, maybe even Indianapolis, connects to this some presumption of foreignness, which is always with us, even outside of these inflection points like COVID or other key moments in American history. So how do we attack that, right? As a way of then hopefully dismantling I'd call this, what we're seeing right now, the violence is the tip of the iceberg, right? It's visible, it's scary, and it's dangerous, but the bulk of the iceberg is underneath the water. We don't see it. But that's the everyday ways in which Asian Americans are seen as foreigners. The model minority myth is a great example of this. So attacking that, I think, takes place in different ways. One is to uncover all the aspects of Asian America that don't fit a model minority notion, right? All of those Asian Americans that we've been kind of referring to or hinting at in this conversation that we don't see in elite spaces, okay? That's one key way. But also when we do see Asian Americans in elite spaces, unpacking how we got here, right? How they got there, and pushing against the cultural assumptions that guide most of those stereotypes. That is just about greatness and their hard work and everything else. And that ignores the fact that many Asians came with high educations in the first place. Many have the capital to invest in education for their kids, benefited from affirmative action programs, or they're able to have networks and mentoring that gave them the guidance to break into, you know, to break glass ceilings here or there. And the last thing I would say in terms of breaking down the model minority stereotype is to understand that when we embrace that stereotype, right, it actually has damaging effects, not only to African Americans, but to the whole notion that, you know, that hard work alone gets you to where you want to be. Right? The premise of the model minority stereotype is to further an American exceptionalism. And if we don't want to buy into that, then we do have to kind of undertake efforts to critique the model minority stereotype. Because if you're buying into that stereotype, you're buying into a lot more than just praising Asians.
So related to the current situation, I think speaking of inclusivity and equity, this is from an anonymous attendee, as what can we do to eradicate vaccine inequality, especially in India, or I guess also other parts of the world?
I think diplomatic messaging by the United States, by a Biden administration that claims to want more multilateral strength. So, you know, engaging not just with states, but with, you know, the UN, the WHO. It takes a lot of legwork, and it takes a lot of timely legwork. So as the crisis in India deepens, you know, the issue that, you know, goes out not just to sort of India diaspora people that are worried about their families, but also to as a global health cause. This is going to be a very critical time in terms of getting resources to boost vaccine equity, but also in terms of how U.S. institutions are doing in terms of talking to states, but also to non-state actors. So this is you know, it's definitely a tall task, and the response is definitely something that's happening in real time.
Thank you. Okay, then due to interest of time, I would like to move on to next question from Christopher Tong from University of Maryland. He asked, I'm interested in how Asians, AAPIs can build unity and help amplify one another's work. If there is one idea or slogan that you'd like other Asian AAPI colleagues to amplify, what would it be?
I'll just say one quick thing, which is, and I like the idea of a slogan, so it makes it harder for us. We can't talk for half an hour. I'll say solidarity, right? Working with other groups, because it's not just about the betterment of Asians per se. It's about creating the conditions for people, you know, of all types to thrive. And so solidarity is critical to that.
Thank you. I think that was great.
Mine would be, please listen to other people from other specializations. This is something that I like to try to do. I like to think that part of my job is continuing to be a student, because I'm not going to know everything about, you know, different states in Asia. I don't know a lot of things about China, and, you know, staying humble and being able to continue to grow as a learner and as a specialist is something that'll get you pretty far.
Great.
I will second both of those comments. It's not a slogan, but I would say always be respectful and be curious. So I think if you have those two things, you can move forward, and you can be helpful in any of these causes.
I think all those were great, great points. Now, I think we only have 2 minutes left. I would like to end with this final question. This is from anonymous attendee. I am new to this space and conversation. What books, resources can you all suggest in supporting my growth? I work in education, nonprofit, but I am open to other topics as well.
I will suggest, for years I taught Asian Americans an interpretive history, a short introduction to Asian American history by Su Chung Chan. And now I've just started teaching a series, a very short introduction to Asian American history by Madeline Y. Hsu.
Okay, Audrey suggests The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee. And Patty suggests A Very Short Introduction to Asian American History by Madeline Yu. Okay, great. I think it's time to conclude our panel discussion. It was really our privilege to have all of our panelists today from the field of academia, policy, and the media to really, contribute to our discussion today. I hope our attendees found our discussion helpful, and I would like to thank Director Guzman for staying with us throughout the entire session. And then I would also like to thank our attendees for submitting excellent questions. I apologize for not being able to cover all of them, but I hope you found our discussion and answers to be helpful. And once again, I would like to thank our panelists for their excellent contribution to this very important discussion. I mean, our goal was not to come up with any, definition or conclusion about this very broad and important topic. But I think there are a lot of important points related to diversity, inclusiveness, equity during our discussion today. And I would like to thank you once again. And also I would like to thank our staff members for organizing this event today. Thank you all, and stay safe, and I hope we'll be able to meet again. Bye.